a folding table, a stack of laminated badges, and a man in a cheap gray blazer, pointing his finger at a 61-year-old woman and telling a line of 40 strangers that she had no right to sit there. He never asked her name. He never looked at the badge already clipped to her cardigan. He just wanted her gone, 20 minutes after the polls opened, in front of everybody. By the next morning, that same woman would be running the entire county's elections. Her name was Odetta Marchand, Des, to everyone who had ever needed her, and by 8:15 that morning, half of Pruitt County had needed her at some point in their lives. What Judge Harold Voss didn't know, standing there with her badge pinched between two fingers like it was something dirty, was that the woman he'd just humiliated in front of a line of voters had spent 22 years making sure this county's elections ran clean, fair, and countable, down to the last provisional ballot. And he had no idea that before the sun set on this particular Tuesday, the state of Georgia, the actual state, was going to walk through that firehouse door and ask him, point blank, what exactly he thought he was doing. The Third Ward firehouse smelled like it always did on election mornings. Coffee gone slightly bitter in the urn, wet umbrellas propped in a mop bucket by the door, the faint diesel ghost of the trucks that used to live where the voting booths now stood in 3 crooked rows. Rain had come through before dawn, a thin gray drizzle that left the parking lot slick and the windows fogged at the corners. Fluorescent light buzzed overhead, flat and unflattering, the kind that made everyone in line look a little tired and a little cold. Outside, a flag hung heavy and dripping from its pole, not enough wind yet to lift it. Voters stood in a line that curled out the door, and along the brick wall, a retired mill worker in a rain-spotted Carhartt jacket, a young mother balancing a toddler on her hip while she juggled her ID and a folded sample ballot, 2 college kids in matching sorority sweatshirts scrolling their phones, an old man leaning on a cane with a purple heart pin on his collar. Somebody's radio, low in a parked truck outside, was playing gospel through a cracked window. It was the kind of crowd that didn't have anywhere else particular to be at 7:45 on a Tuesday morning. Except here, which was exactly why what happened next landed the way it did, in front of every single one of them. Behind the check-in table, 3 folding chairs and 3 laptops linked to the county's electronic poll books. Odetta Marchand sat in the middle chair, the one she'd sat in for every election since Bill Clinton's 2nd term, her reading glasses pushed up into gray-black curls, a legal pad at her elbow, with the day's precinct numbers already written in her careful school-teacher hand. She had a cardigan, the color of dried lavender, buttoned to the collar, because the firehouse was always cold before the doors opened, and always sweltering by 10. On the table in front of her sat a laminated badge on a blue lanyard, county seal stamped in gold, Odetta Marchand, Certa Manager, Pruitt County. Everything about that table told you, if you knew how to read it, that this was a woman who ran a tight operation. The provisional ballot envelopes were stacked by precinct, sub-district, corner squared. A worn manila folder, edges gone soft from years of handling, held the laminated, cure affidavit instructions she'd typed up herself a decade back, because the county's official version, in her professional opinion, buried the actual deadline in language nobody without a law degree could parse on the spot. A paper cup of pens sat exactly within arm's reach, refilled from her own purse, because pens had a way of walking off by mid-morning, and she'd learned a long time ago not to depend on the county to restock them. Even the extension cord running to her laptop had been taped down along the floor in a neat, deliberate line so no voter, elderly or otherwise, would catch a toe on it and go down on the concrete. Nothing about it was showy. All of it was intentional. 22 years of small, unglamorous decisions, made carefully, by a woman most people in that line had never once had reason to think twice about. Which was, in its own way, the whole point of doing the job well. Nobody notices the table that never wobbles. It had never once, in 22 years, been questioned, until Harold Voss walked in. He came through the side door at 7:52, 8 minutes before doors open, in a navy blazer, a size too sharp for a county election judge, county lanyard swinging, a clipboard tucked under one arm, like a man auditioning for a role he hadn't been cast in. He was 54, silver at the temples, in a way he clearly knew was flattering, and he had the particular energy of someone who had spent the last several days being told, by someone more important than him, that today mattered. He stopped at the check-in table. He looked at Odetta. He looked at her badge. He looked at her again. "Excuse me," he said, loud enough that the first 6 people in line turned their heads. "Who signed off on you?" Odetta didn't look up right away. She was finishing a line on the precinct log. "Good morning to you too, Judge Voss. I need to see your certification. Current year." He said it like he was reading off a script, chin lifted, eyes flicking toward the line of voters as if to make sure they were watching. They were. "It's right here." She tapped the badge on her chest without unclipping it. "Same one I've worn every election since you were in high school, I expect." A ripple of quiet laughter from the line. Voss's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking for a joke, ma'am. I'm asking for documentation. There's been some concerns raised about—" He paused, chose his words with visible care. "About who's actually credentialed to be sitting at that table today. Concerns raised by who?" This from Reggie, 19. A poll clerk in a county-issued vest 2 sizes too big, who'd been folding ballots at the end of the table, and now stood very still, sensing something. "That's not your business, son." Voss didn't even look at him. Odetta set her pen down. Slow, deliberate. The kind of slow that, if you knew her, meant she was doing everything in her power, not to say the first 4 things that came to mind. "Judge Voss. I trained the poll manager certification course for this county for 11 years. I trained you, if I recall, back when you were an alternate judge over in the 14th. Something flickered across his face, recognition, maybe, or the memory of being a nervous alternate in a folding chair, while a black woman 20 years his senior corrected his ballot reconciliation math in front of the room. Whatever it was, he buried it fast. "That's exactly the kind of thing I need to verify independently," he said. "I can't just take your word for it. You could look at the badge. Badges get made in a lot of places, ma'am." The line had gone very quiet. Somewhere near the door, a phone came up. A young woman in a denim jacket, dark hair pulled back, thumb already tapping record before she'd fully decided to. Her name was Priya Anand, 24. Here to vote before her hospital shift. And she would later say she didn't plan on filming anything. It was just instinct, the same instinct that makes you grab a phone when a fender bender happens in front of you. Something's happening. Better have proof. "Sir," with respect, Reggie again stepping half in front of the table now. "Miss Dess has run this precinct longer than I've been alive. I didn't ask you either." Voss's voice sharpened, cracked at the edges, with something that sounded less like authority, and more like fear wearing authority's clothes. He reached across the table. His fingers closed around the laminated badge, around the blue lanyard still looped over Odetta's neck, and he pulled. The lanyard caught for a second at her collar before it gave, the little metal clasp popping loose, with a sound too small for what it meant. Silence. Not the polite kind. The kind that has weight. The kind where you can hear the coffee urn ticking as it cools, and somebody's shoe scuff against linoleum, and absolutely nothing else. Odetta didn't move, didn't reach for it. Her hands, folded now on the table in front of her, had gone very still. The particular stillness of someone who has spent a lifetime learning that her anger, however justified, would always be read as something else if she let it show on her face in front of white people who outranked her on paper. Her heart was going hard enough that she could feel it in her ears. Her stomach had dropped somewhere down around her shoes. But her voice, when it came, was even. "You want to step outside and finish this conversation, Judge Voss? Or you want to keep going in front of the whole line? I think the line deserves to know who's processing their ballots." He said it like a mic drop. He even half turned toward the voters, like he expected applause. He got the opposite. That's Miss Des, said the old man, with the purple heart pin, leaning harder on his cane, like he might come up out of it. She helped my wife get her provisional ballot counted in 2016, when the state messed up her address. Woman drove out to our house herself with the paperwork. She ran the polling place at my mama's assisted living for 6 years, said the mother with the toddler on her hip, not raising her voice, just stating a fact the way you'd state the weather. You want to explain to me why you're taking her badge? This is a procedural matter, Voss said, and even he could hear now that his voice had gone thin. Looks like a personal matter to me, someone muttered near the back, and a few heads nodded. Priya kept the phone up, kept recording. Her thumb was sweating on the screen. Odetta stood, finally, chair scraping back against the concrete floor, and the sound of it seemed enormous in the quiet. She was not a tall woman. She did not need to be. Judge Voss, she said, you can hold that badge if it makes you feel like you did something today. But those poll books don't run themselves. And this line isn't getting any shorter, and somebody in this room is going to have to actually open this precinct on time. So you tell me, is that going to be you, or is that going to be me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he squared his shoulders, the way a man does when he's decided the only way out of a hole is to keep digging in the same direction. I'm going to need everyone in this line to remain calm, he announced. To nobody in particular, in the voice of someone narrating his own authority into existence. This is a credentialing matter, and it will be resolved through proper channels. Proper channels, Reggie repeated, and something in the flatness of his voice made it sound less like agreement and more like an accusation. You want to tell me what proper channel involves grabbing a woman by her collar? I did not grab her by the collar. Voss's voice cracked upward on the word collar, the first real fracture in his composure. I removed an improperly verified credential. You didn't verify anything. This from a woman near the middle of the line, arms crossed over a scrub top, clearly headed to a hospital shift the second this was over. You walked in and decided. That's not verifying. That's just deciding. Ma'am, I don't believe I asked for public commentary on precinct administration. And I don't believe I asked to stand in a line for 40 minutes watching a grown man bully a grandmother. The woman shot back, and this time the laughter that rippled through the crowd had a harder edge to it, less nervous, more united. A few people actually clapped, quick and scattered, before catching themselves. Voss's eyes swept the room, looking for an ally and finding none. Even the 2 college kids near the door had stopped scrolling their phones. One of them had her hand pressed flat over her mouth, the particular posture of someone watching a car crash happen in slow motion and unable to look away. I could call the sheriff's office, Voss said, and it came out sounding less like a threat and more like a man grasping for the only lever he had left. If this line intends to obstruct precinct operations, son. Eugene Poe's cane thumped once against the linoleum, sharp, deliberate, the sound of a man who'd decided he'd heard enough. The only person obstructing precinct operations this morning is you. I fought for this woman's right to sit at that table just as much as I fought for my own right to walk up to it. You call the sheriff if you want to. I expect he already knows Miss Des a good deal better than he knows you. That landed. Voss's mouth opened and then closed again. No words behind it this time. Judge Voss. Odetta's voice, when it cut back through the murmur, was calm in a way that somehow silenced the room, faster than any raised voice could have. I am going to ask you one more time, and then I am going to stop asking, because we have voters standing in the rain who deserve better than watching the 2 of us argue over a laminated card. Are you going to let this precinct open on time, or are you not? Behind him, unnoticed by everyone in that room, a black Ford Explorer with state plates was pulling into the lot, 90 minutes ahead of a schedule. Nobody at the 3rd Ward firehouse had been told about. Nobody in that room had any idea yet how much that morning was about to cost Harold Voss, or how much it was about to change, for good, for Odetta Marchand. Let's rewind. Not far, just 6 months back, to understand exactly what that badge cost Odetta Marchand to earn, and why watching it come off her collar in front of 40 strangers hit different than it would have for almost anybody else standing at that table. Rewind. 6 months earlier, on an ordinary Tuesday that had nothing to do with elections at all, Odetta Marchand was up at 5:15, the way she'd been up at 5:15 for the better part of 40 years. Not because an alarm told her to, because her body simply didn't know how to sleep later than that anymore. Not since the years of getting her own children ready for school, then her grandbaby, then 2 decades of setting out donuts and paperwork for volunteer poll workers who needed feeding before they could be expected to be useful. The house was small, a brick rancher on Larkspur Street that her late husband, Ellis, had put a new roof on with his own hands the summer before he passed, insisting the whole time that he didn't need help, even as his knees gave him trouble on the ladder. She kept his tools in the shed exactly where he'd left them. She hadn't moved a single wrench. Some things you just let be. Her morning started with a pot of coffee, black, and a Bible reading at the kitchen table. And then, because 11-year-old Milo, her grandson, still needed rousing twice before he'd actually get vertical, a second cup of coffee, accompanied by the particular parenting art of yelling up a stairwell in a tone that managed to be loving and threatening in equal measure. Milo Andre Marchand, if I have to come up there, I'm up. Grandma Des, you said that 4 minutes ago. I'm more up now. She'd laugh despite herself every single time, the same way she'd laughed at his mother's excuses 25 years before that. Milo's mother, Odetta's daughter, Renata, had passed 3 years back, an aneurysm nobody saw coming, gone in an afternoon, and Odetta had gone from grandmother to mother again at 58, without a single day to prepare for it. She didn't talk about that much. When people asked how she managed, raising a boy that age on a fixed income at her age, she had one answer, always the same, a phrase her own grandmother used to say over the ironing board when times were lean. Steady hands, baby. Steady hands count for something even when nothing else does. She'd worked 26 years as a teacher's aide at Pruitt County Elementary before retiring, the kind of job that pays too little for what it asks of you, and gets remembered by exactly no one except the hundreds of kids who needed someone patient in the room when the actual teacher was stretched too thin to notice them drowning. She still ran into former students at the grocery store, grown now, some with kids of their own, all of them saying some version of Miss Des, you probably don't remember me, but, and she always did remember, everyone. Her pension covered the mortgage and groceries, and Milo's basketball shoes, which he grew out of every 8 months like clockwork, and not much beyond that. She clipped coupons. She kept the thermostat at 68 in winter, and sweated it out in summer rather than run the AC before June. She sewed her own hems. None of this troubled her particularly. She'd never had much, and she'd never confused having little with having nothing. What she did have, what she'd built, deliberately, over 22 years, was a reputation. Not flashy, not the kind that made the newspaper, the kind that mattered more. When something in Pruitt County's elections went sideways, people called Des. When a 91-year-old veteran's provisional ballot got flagged over a mismatched signature because his hand had started shaking from Parkinson's, it was Odetta who drove the affidavit paperwork out to his house herself on a Sunday, sat with him at his kitchen table, and walked him through it word by word until his hand, shaking the whole time, got it right. When a young mother 2 towns over showed up 8 months pregnant, in labor pains she was trying to power through because she'd waited in line 90 minutes and wasn't about to lose her spot, it was Odetta who wheeled a chair over, held her hand, and got her processed and out the door in 4 minutes flat before calling her a ride to the hospital herself. She trained new poll workers every cycle, patient, exacting, funny in a dry way that snuck up on you. You will count that ballot box 3 times. She'd tell every new class, once because you're supposed to, once because you're nervous, and once Because Miss Des is standing behind you and you don't want to explain to her why your numbers don't match. They always laughed. They always counted 3 times anyway, for years afterward, because some habits her calm insistence built into you stuck for good. She sat on the county's elections advisory committee, unpaid, because somebody needed to be in that room, asking the plain, uncomfortable questions. Why is early voting only available at one site for a county this size? Why does the 4th Ward polling location keep losing its ADA ramp signage? Why are we still hand-counting provisionals at midnight, instead of during the day, when people are fresher and less likely to make mistakes? She wasn't universally loved for asking. She didn't much care. On Wednesday evenings, she sat on the fellowship committee at Mount Calvary Baptist, in the church basement with its folding chairs and its smell of old hymnals and percolating coffee. And it was there, 4 months before that election Tuesday, that her friend Louise Fenwick had first noticed something was off. "You're favoring that right hand again," Louise said, watching Odetta struggle a beat too long to uncap her pen. "Arthritis flaring?" "It's nothing." Odetta flexed her fingers under the table, out of sight. "Des, Louise, I am 50 cents from finishing these sign-up sheets for the Thanksgiving basket drive, and I am not discussing my hands." She said it with enough dry humor that Louise let it go, laughing despite herself. But the truth Odetta didn't say out loud to anyone. Not to Louise, not to her doctor more than once a year when she could help it, not even to Milo, was that the arthritis in her right hand had been getting worse for 2 winters running. And the medication that actually helped ran $41 a month after her insurance's portion, and $41 a month was, more often than she'd have liked to admit, the same $41 that needed to go toward Milo's growing feet or the electric bill in July. She skipped the refill more months than she filled it. She never once mentioned this to a soul, because in her experience, the moment people started seeing you as someone who needed help, they stopped seeing you as someone capable of giving it, and giving help was the only currency Odetta Marchand had ever really trusted. "All right, ladies." Pastor Weaver, up at the front of the fellowship hall, cleared his throat over the low chatter. "Before we adjourn, Miss Des, you had something for the group about the elderly outreach?" "I do." Odetta stood, smoothing her skirt, and pulled a folded list from her purse. "Early voting starts in 3 weeks. I've got 11 names here. Folks in this congregation over 80, some of them without reliable transportation, a couple with vision that makes reading a ballot difficult without help. I'd like 4 volunteers to ride along with me on Saturdays. We drive them to the early voting site. We wait. We drive them home. No politics discussed in the car, I mean that. We're not there to tell anybody how to vote. We're there to make sure they can." "I'll ride," Louise said immediately, hand already up. "Same," said a younger man near the back, Deacon Price's son, home from college for the semester. "My grandmother's on that list, isn't she?" "She might be." Odetta's mouth twitched, the closest she came in public to outright mischief. "I couldn't possibly say." It got a real laugh, warm and easy, the kind that told you everyone in that basement understood exactly what she was doing and loved her for it anyway. Later, after the meeting broke and folding chairs got stacked against the wall, Louise caught her by the coat rack. "You ever slow down, Des?" "What would I slow down for?" "I don't know, yourself maybe. You've got a grandbaby to raise, a full committee schedule, that poll manager job that doesn't pay you what it's worth, and hands that hurt you more than you let on. Man doesn't run himself into the ground forever without something breaking." Odetta pulled her coat on, considered the question longer than she let on, and finally said, quiet, mostly to herself, "My grandmother used to say steady hands count for something, even when nothing else does. I've been living off that since I was younger than Milo is now. I don't know how to slow down and still believe it." Louise didn't have an answer for that. Neither, if she was honest, did Odetta. It was simply the shape her life had taken. One small act of stubborn service, stacked on top of another for so many years that the shape had become, at some point without her quite noticing who she was, and every election morning without fail, rain or shine, arthritis flaring or not, 5:15 wake-up or not. Odetta Marchand put on that lavender cardigan, clipped that badge to her collar, kissed Milo on the top of his head on her way out the door, and drove to the Third Ward firehouse to make sure that whatever else happened in this country on any given Tuesday, the people of her precinct got to vote and got counted. Clean. That was the woman standing behind the folding table when Harold Voss decided, without checking a single piece of paper, that she didn't belong there. Meanwhile, 90 miles north, in a glass and limestone office building, 3 blocks from the state capitol, a man named Marcus Aldridge was standing at his window at 6:40 that same morning, with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, looking out over a city that had no idea yet what kind of day it was about to become. Marcus was 39, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections Administration, a title that sounded, to most people who heard it at a dinner party, considerably more boring than the job actually was. He'd held the post for 2 years, appointed after a decade practicing election law, the kind of unglamorous, detail-obsessed work that involved reading statutes at midnight and caring, with an intensity most people reserved for their own children, about things like chain of custody logs and provisional ballot cure deadlines. He wore his suits, a size too conservative for his age, and kept his office bare except for 2 things: a framed photo of his mother, gone 11 years now, and a single sheet of notebook paper, in a cheap black frame that most visitors assumed was some kind of ironic decoration. It wasn't ironic. It was the only thing in that office that actually mattered to him. His chief of staff, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Ohanu, knocked twice and let herself in without waiting for an answer, the way she always did. Sweep schedules confirmed. 7 counties, unannounced. You're starting with Pruitt. Pruitt first. Marcus turned from the window. That's a 2-hour drive before we even get to the other 6. Complaint volumes up out of Pruitt this cycle. Provisional ballot numbers look strange on the pre-report. High rejection rate concentrated in 3 precincts, all clustered in the same part of the county. Might be nothing. Might be a training issue. Might be, she shrugged, the particular shrug of someone who'd seen every version of might be over 15 years in elections oversight. Something else. Either way, it's the runoff. State's watching this one close. You wanted to be hands-on. I did. He set the coffee down, picked up his jacket, paused, the way he always paused, at the small black frame on his desk, and read, as he did most mornings, out of habit more than need, since he had every word of it memorized, a single line of looping, patient, red pen handwriting, on a photocopied worksheet, from a 7th grade civics class more than 25 years gone. Marcus, you argue like you already know you're right. That's a gift. Learn to use it for something bigger than winning. Miss Dess, he'd been 14 the year he almost didn't graduate middle school. Failing 2 classes. Angry at a world that had taken his father to a county jail cell, and his mother to double shifts that left her too exhausted most nights to check his homework. And heading, by every honest measure anyone could have made at the time, toward a future that didn't include college, didn't include a law degree, didn't include this office with his name on the door. What it had included, instead, was a teacher's aide named Odetta Marchand, who noticed him sleeping through 3rd period, who didn't send him to the office, who instead sat down next to him after the bell one Tuesday afternoon and said, without a shred of pity in her voice, "You're not tired, baby. You're drowning. Those are 2 different things, and I want to know which one we're dealing with." She'd kept him after school twice a week for the rest of that year. Not out of any official duty, she wasn't paid for it, wasn't asked to do it, did it on her own time between her own long shifts. She fed him peanut butter crackers from a tin she kept in her desk drawer because she'd clocked, without ever saying so out loud, that he wasn't always eating dinner. She drilled him on essay structure, with the same exacting patience she'd one day bring to training poll workers on chain of custody procedures. She wrote him a letter of recommendation for a summer enrichment program that changed the trajectory of his entire academic life. A letter he still had, somewhere, in a box in his mother's old house. The last time he'd seen her in person had been 9 years ago, at his mother's funeral, when Odetta Marchand, who by then hadn't taught him in over 2 decades, showed up anyway, sat in the third pew, and afterward took both his hands in hers, and said only, "Your mama did good, and so did you, and don't you let anybody tell you different." He hadn't been back to Pruitt County since. He hadn't told anyone at the Secretary of State's office that the 7th county on this morning's unannounced sweep list happened to be the county where the woman who'd saved his life, quietly, without ceremony, 25 years ago, still worked the polls. He hadn't told them because he hadn't put it together yet himself. Not until Priscilla said the word Pruitt out loud in his office at 6:42 that morning, and something in his chest went tight and warm at once, the particular feeling of a name from your own history walking, uninvited, back into your present. One specific afternoon came back to him now, unbidden, the way certain memories do when a single word cracks them loose. He'd been maybe 6 weeks into their after-school sessions, still sullen about it, still showing up more because she made it hard to say no than because he wanted to be there. He'd slammed a pencil down over a practice essay he couldn't get right and said, with all the wounded fury of a 14-year-old convinced the world had already decided who he was going to be, "Why do you even care? I'm not your kid. I'm not even in your actual class. You could just let the office deal with me like everybody else does." She hadn't raised her voice. She never did. She'd just set down the stack of essays she was grading, looked at him steady over the top of her glasses, and said, "Because somebody let me drown once too, baby. And I promised myself I'd never watch it happen to somebody else if I had the power to do one single thing about it. You've got the power in you. You just don't believe it yet. My job isn't to make you believe it today. My job is to keep showing up until you do." He'd cried that day, a little angry and embarrassed about it, and she'd pretended not to notice, sliding the peanut butter crackers across the desk instead, and saying only, "Eat something. Can't argue essay structure on an empty stomach." He was 39 years old, sitting in the back of a state-issued Explorer 25 years later, and he still remembered the exact taste of those crackers. "You all right?" Priscilla asked, glancing over from the driver's seat, somewhere around the county line, having clocked the particular quiet that had settled over him for the last several miles. "Yeah," he cleared his throat. "Just thinking through the numbers again. Walk me through the pre-report one more time. 3rd Ward. Elm Hollow, Birchfield Terrace. All 3 showing provisional rejection rates north of 30% this cycle, against a county average sitting at 9. All 3 precincts, same election judge, overseeing them this cycle for the first time. A Harold Voss, previously an alternate judge in the 14th, moved up after the last registrar's retirement left some reshuffling. No prior disciplinary record. No prior complaints that I could find, actually, which is its own kind of strange, because usually a jump that steep comes with a paper trail of somebody flagging it earlier. Or it means whoever's usually catching those problems early got pushed out of the room before they had the chance. Marcus watched the pine trees blur past the window, county road signs starting to look more familiar than he'd expected them to, 25 years on. "You said complaint volume was up. Complaints from where, exactly? Mostly informal. A couple of calls to the county elections office that got logged but not escalated. One formal written complaint, filed 3 weeks ago by a precinct manager in Elm Hollow, Rosa Delgado. County never responded to it. It's still sitting open in the queue. That's not nothing." Marcus's jaw tightened. A written complaint, 3 weeks unanswered, right before a runoff this close. Pull everything on Delgado's complaint before we get there. I want to have read it before I walk in that door. Already forwarded to your tablet. Priscilla glanced at him again, longer this time. "You want to tell me why Pruitt specifically has you like this? You've been quiet since I said the name. He almost didn't answer. Then he did, quiet, looking out the window instead of at her. There's a woman who works the polls out there. She's the reason I'm sitting in this car at all, doing this job, instead of somewhere considerably worse off than I am. I haven't seen her in 9 years. I didn't know I was going to see her again today until about 20 minutes ago. Priscilla, who had worked in elections administration long enough to know, when a piece of information mattered, more than it sounded like it should, didn't push further. She just nodded, once, and pressed a little harder on the gas. Pruitt first, Marcus said again, quieter this time, mostly to himself, watching the exit sign for the county come up fast in the windshield. He had no idea, driving south with his coffee cooling untouched in the cup holder, that he was about to walk into the 3rd Ward firehouse, at almost exactly the moment Harold Voss finally succeeded in embarrassing himself in front of the one person in Pruitt County, least likely to let it slide quietly. Back up 4 days, to understand what had actually put Harold Voss in the mood to snatch a badge off a woman's collar in front of 40 strangers, because a man doesn't wake up one Tuesday morning and decide, out of nowhere, to humiliate the most respected poll manager in the county. Something puts him there. In Voss's case, that something had a name. Boyd Tillman. Tillman was a turnout strategist. That was the phrase on his business card, anyway, under a firm name, Chalkline Consulting, that didn't appear on any public filing anyone had bothered to check. He'd shown up in Pruitt County 8 weeks before the runoff, working, officially, for a state legislative campaign that badly needed this county's numbers to break a certain way in a certain set of precincts. Unofficially, he did the kind of work that never appeared on a single invoice, the kind that happened over steak dinners and in parking lots, in phone calls placed from burner numbers, in favors extended to local officials who were flattered to be noticed by someone from the Capitol, and too insecure to ask too many questions about why. Harold Voss had been an election judge for 6 years, always in smaller, quieter precincts, always more or less invisible, and invisibility to a man like Voss had started to feel less like safety and more like failure. He wanted to matter. He wanted badly for someone important to look at him and see competence, authority, the things he suspected correctly that he'd never quite earned on his own. Boyd Tillman had clocked that hunger inside of 90 seconds of their first conversation at a county GOP mixer 6 weeks back, and he'd spent every week since feeding it, carefully, the way you'd feed a stray dog to make sure it kept coming back. "You're wasted at that firehouse, Hal," Tillman had told him over drinks, 10 days before Election Day, in a back booth at a steakhouse 40 minutes outside Pruitt, where nobody local was likely to see them together. "A man with your instincts should be running for county commissioner next cycle. But first you gotta prove you can run a tight ship. Prove you're not just some guy handing out stickers. I run a tight ship," Voss had said, a little too fast. "Sure you do." Tillman had smiled in the particular way of men who'd built entire careers on making other men feel simultaneously flattered and small. "But here's the thing about a tight ship, Hal. Sometimes it means making a hard call nobody else has the stomach to make. You know your precinct's numbers this cycle are gonna be close. Countywide, this whole runoff comes down to maybe 1,100 votes. You know which precincts are gonna decide it. The 3rd Ward's one of them. The 3rd Ward is exactly one of them." Tillman had leaned forward. "And you know as well as I do that a good chunk of those provisional ballots, the ones that come in with an address mismatch, an ID hiccup, whatever, a good chunk of those, if you're being honest, are borderline calls, judgment calls. And judgment calls belong to the judge. You're not asking me to throw out valid ballots." Voss had said it like a statement. It had come out sounding more like a question. "I would never ask you to do a single illegal thing, Hal." Tillman had spread his hands, wide, innocent. "I'm asking you to enforce the rules, strictly. No favors, no exceptions. No letting some poll manager, who's been doing this 20 years, wave through every borderline signature, because she's decided she knows better than the statute. That's not corruption. That's diligence. and a man who shows real diligence on election day. A man who's willing to be the adult in the room when everybody else wants to look the other way. That's a man people start talking about for bigger things. It had worked exactly the way Tillman intended it to work, which is to say slowly, and mostly through Voss's own vanity, rather than any direct instruction that could ever be traced back to chalkline consulting on paper. Over the following days, Voss had quietly begun flagging provisional ballots in the 3rd Ward, and 2 adjoining precincts, Elm Hollow and Birchfield Terrace, both, like the 3rd Ward, precincts with higher concentrations of Black and Latino voters than the county average, at a rate nearly 4 times what the same precincts had shown in the last cycle. He'd started a private folder on his laptop, labeled, with a kind of self-justifying blandness, pending review, signature discrepancies. He hadn't told anyone at the county elections office he was doing it. He'd told himself it was diligence, exactly like Tillman said, and every time a small cold feeling crept up his spine at 2 in the morning, telling him it was something uglier than that, he pushed it back down with the memory of Tillman's voice saying, "People start talking about for bigger things." 2 days before Election Day, at a second dinner, this one at Tillman's insistence, at a diner just off the highway, nowhere either of them was known, Tillman had handed Voss a single sheet of paper with 3 precinct names circled in blue ink: 3rd Ward, Elm Hollow, Birchfield Terrace. "These 3 are your ship," Tillman had said. "You run 'em tight. Anybody gives you trouble, any poll worker who wants to wave through a discrepancy because they know the voter personally." He'd said the phrase with a faint, dismissive curl to his mouth that Voss hadn't examined too closely at the time. "You remind them who's actually credentialed to make that call. You understand me?" Voss had understood him, or told himself he did. The Thursday before, doing his rounds of the 3 precincts under his new authority, he'd stopped by Elm Hollow and found Rosa Delgado exactly where he expected her, sharp, organized, running a precinct with the kind of no-nonsense competence that had made her, in only her 2nd cycle, managing a polling site, one of the county's most respected younger poll workers. "You're doing cure affidavits for every address mismatch that comes through?" he'd asked her, flipping through her log with the same clipboard authority posture he'd bring to the 3rd Ward 5 days later. "Everyone the statute allows, yes." Rosa hadn't looked up from the voter she was helping. "That's what the law requires, Judge Voss. The law gives you discretion on close calls. The law gives voters the right to cure a documentation issue within the window. I'm not in the business of deciding which voters deserve that right, and which don't based on how close I personally feel the call is." She'd finally looked at him then, steady, unbothered by his rank. "Is there a specific ballot you have a concern about? Or is this a general audit? Just making sure standards are consistent across the precincts I'm overseeing this cycle. Then, you'll find my standards are the statute. Word for word. I don't improvise." She'd gone back to her voter, effectively ending the conversation, and Voss had left feeling smaller than he'd walked in, which, if he'd been honest with himself in that moment, was exactly the feeling Tillman had spent 6 weeks teaching him to convert into something else. Not smallness. Diligence. He'd driven straight from Elm Hollow to his car in the lot and typed up the complaint about her being too generous with cure opportunities. Before the resentment had even fully cooled, filed it with the county elections office by 5 that evening, and felt, filling it out, a small ugly satisfaction he didn't examine too closely. The county never called Rosa about it. Nobody ever called Rosa about it. It simply sat in a queue, unread, the way so many things sit unread in county offices too, understaffed to keep up with their own paperwork, which was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of failure, though not one anyone would connect to what happened at the 3rd Ward firehouse until much later. Sunday night, alone in his kitchen, with the folder of 41 flagged ballots open on the table in front of him, Voss had come as close as he ever would to turning back. He'd sat there past midnight, a glass of bourbon going warm and untouched at his elbow, scrolling back through Tillman's texts, rereading the phrase diligence, not corruption, until the word stopped meaning anything at all, the way any phrase does if you repeat it to yourself enough times trying to make it true. He thought, briefly, about calling the county elections director and asking her, point blank, whether a 4-time spike in rejections across 3 specific precincts was something anyone would actually sign off on if he asked out loud instead of just doing it quietly. He didn't make the call. He told himself it was because it was late, because she'd be asleep, because there'd be time to explain it properly in the morning, if anyone ever asked. The truth, underneath all of that, was simpler and considerably less flattering. Some small, honest part of him already suspected what the answer would be, and he didn't want to hear it before he'd had the chance to find out whether Tillman's promise of mattering was actually going to pay off first. He closed the folder, went to bed, told himself, one more time, that he was simply enforcing the rules, what Voss hadn't accounted for. What a man like Boyd Tillman, parachuting into a county he didn't actually live in or care about, working it for 6 weeks, and then vanishing the day after the runoff. Regardless of what happened to the people left holding the consequences, had never bothered to explain to him was that who's actually credentialed to make that call in the 3rd Ward had, for 22 years, been Odetta Marchand. And that Odetta Marchand did not, in fact, wave through discrepancies out of favoritism. She caught them, documented them, cured them where the law allowed it, and rejected them, cleanly and correctly, where it didn't, a process that took patience and knowledge of the actual statute, rather than a blunt 4 times higher rejection rate. Applied indiscriminately to 3 precincts that happened to share a demographic profile. By Monday night, the night before Election Day, Voss had a folder of 41 provisional ballots from the 3 targeted precincts marked for rejection, nearly 3 times the number his own training would have told him was normal for precincts that size, if he'd bothered to check the numbers against any prior cycle, which he hadn't. He had a text message on his personal phone, unwisely still saved, from an unlisted number he'd labeled only BT. Tomorrow's the day, Hal. Show him what a real judge looks like, and he had. Underneath the ambition Tillman had spent 6 weeks polishing into something that looked, in the mirror, almost like principle. A cold, small, gnawing fear that if any of this ever actually got looked at closely, by the wrong person, on the wrong day, it was going to look exactly like what it was. He hadn't planned to take it out on Odetta Marchand specifically. Not consciously. But when he'd walked into the 3rd Ward firehouse Tuesday morning and seen her sitting there, 22 years of quiet, exacting, uncompromising competence radiating off her like heat off asphalt, the one person in that building who would absolutely notice if his rejection numbers didn't add up, who would ask the plain, uncomfortable question in front of everyone, the way she always did on the advisory committee, some ugly, cornered animal instinct in him had decided that the safest move was to discredit her first. Make her the story. Make her the problem. Get her rattled. Get her removed. Get the morning off to a start where nobody was checking his math too closely. It had felt, for about 90 seconds, like it might actually work. Then a black Ford Explorer with state plates pulled into the lot. The Explorer parked crooked, in a hurry, and Marcus Aldridge got out of it, already scanning the lot, a habit from years of unannounced site visits, clocking the line length, the signage, the flow of people in and out, and it took him a full 3 seconds standing on the wet asphalt to register that something about the scene through the firehouse's fogged front windows was wrong. Voters weren't moving, a line that should have been shuffling forward in that particular, restless, coffee-deprived way lines. Shuffle at 8 a.m. was instead standing dead still, everyone's attention pointed at something inside. He crossed the lot fast, Priscilla half a step behind him with her state ID lanyard already out, and pushed through the firehouse door into a silence, so total it felt like walking into a held breath. He saw Odetta first, standing behind the check-in table, spine straight, chin level, The particular posture of a woman observing unfair, without letting it move her an inch. A posture Marcus recognized instantly and completely, because he'd watched her hold that exact same posture once before, 25 years ago, in a school hallway, while a vice principal who didn't like her tone told her she had no business advocating for a problem student who wasn't even her own son. He saw, next, a man in a blazer, holding a laminated badge that did not belong to him, a blue lanyard dangling loose from his fist, like evidence he hadn't yet figured out how incriminating it was. "Miss Dess?" The words were out of Marcus's mouth before he'd decided to say them, and they landed in that silent room with the force of a held breath finally releasing. Odetta's head came up. For one full second, her face did something it hadn't done in that firehouse in 22 years of election mornings. It opened, completely, unguarded, the careful professional stillness cracking into something younger and more astonished. "Marcus?" Her voice caught on his name like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it out loud. "Here, in this uniform, in this role." "Marcus Aldridge?" "Yes, ma'am." He crossed the room in 4 long strides, past the check-in table, past a stunned Reggie, past 40 voters who had absolutely no idea what they were watching, but understood, on some animal level, that they were watching something, and he took both her hands in both of his the exact same way she'd once taken his at his mother's funeral. "It's me. It's Miss Dess. It's really you. Look at you." Her eyes were bright, wet at the corners, and she blinked hard, once, twice, refusing to let it spill over in front of a room full of people, though her voice wobbled just slightly on the words. "Look at you, Deputy Secretary. I read that. I read that in the paper, and I thought, that can't be my Marcus. And then I thought, well, it could be, because I always told you. You told me I argued, like I already knew I was right." He was smiling now, and it was the kind of smile that made him look, for just a moment, exactly like the 14-year-old boy who used to eat peanut butter crackers out of her desk drawer. "I kept the note, Miss Dess. It's in a frame on my desk, every morning." "Oh, hush." But she was smiling too now, unable to help it, one hand coming up to press against her own sternum like she was holding something in. Then Marcus turned, slow, deliberate, the warmth draining out of his face, and something considerably colder moving in behind it, and looked at Harold Voss, still standing there, with a stranger's badge dangling from his fist, in front of a room that had just watched the Deputy Secretary of State for Elections Administration greet a poll worker like family. "You're the judge here?" Marcus's voice had changed entirely. Gone was the warmth. What replaced it was flat, precise, the voice of a man who'd spent a decade in courtrooms, learning exactly how much authority a calm, quiet question could carry. Harold Voss. Voss's hand had gone slack around the lanyard, like he'd only just remembered he was still holding it. I'm the presiding judge for this precinct, and I was in the process of verifying. You were in the process of removing a certified poll manager's credentials in front of voters, without producing a single document that says you had cause to." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so quiet you could hear the coffee urn again. "I've read every complaint filed against this precinct in the last 5 election cycles, Judge Voss. There isn't one with her name on it. Not one." He held out his hand, palm up, unhurried. The badge. Voss looked down at it in his own fist, as if he'd forgotten what it was. Slowly, he set it in Marcus's open hand. Marcus turned, and with the same unhurried care, clipped it back onto Odetta's collar himself, refastening the little metal clasp that had popped loose 40 minutes earlier, the sound of it clicking shut audible in that dead-silent room. "Now," Marcus said, turning back to Voss, and something in the set of his jaw told everyone present that whatever came next was not going to be quick, and it was not going to be quiet. "I'd like to see your provisional ballot log for this precinct. Today's, and this cycle's rejection rate compared to the last 3. Voss opened his mouth, closed it. Somewhere behind his eyes, the math of exactly how much trouble he was in started, visibly, to arrive. "Judge Voss," Marcus said again, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I asked you a question. The Explorer parked crooked, in a hurry, and Marcus Aldridge got out of it already scanning the lot. A habit from years of unannounced site visits, clocking the line length, the signage, the flow of people in and out, and it took him a full 3 seconds, standing on the wet asphalt, to register that something about the scene through the firehouse's fogged front windows was wrong. Voters weren't moving. A line that should have been shuffling forward in that particular restless, coffee-deprived way lines shuffle at 8 a.m. was instead standing dead still. Everyone's attention pointed at something inside. He crossed the lot fast, Priscilla half a step behind him, with her state ID lanyard already out, and pushed through the firehouse door into a silence so total it felt like walking into a held breath. He saw Odetta first, standing behind the check-in table, spine straight, chin level, the particular posture of a woman, absorbing something unfair without letting it move her an inch. A posture Marcus recognized instantly and completely, because he'd watched her hold that exact same posture once before, 25 years ago, in a school hallway, while a vice principal who didn't like her tone told her she had no business advocating for a problem student who wasn't even her own son. He saw, next, a man in a blazer holding a laminated badge that did not belong to him, a blue lanyard dangling loose from his fist like evidence he hadn't yet figured out how incriminating it was. "Miss Des?" The words were out of Marcus's mouth before he'd decided to say them, and they landed in that silent room, with the force of a held breath finally releasing. Odetta's head came up. For one full second, her face did something it hadn't done in that firehouse, in 22 years of election mornings. It opened, completely, unguarded, the careful professional stillness, cracking into something younger and more astonished. "Marcus?" Her voice caught on his name like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say it out loud. "Here, in this uniform, in this role." "Marcus Aldridge?" "Yes, ma'am." He crossed the room in 4 long strides, past the check-in table, past a stunned Reggie, past 40 voters who had absolutely no idea what they were watching, but understood, on some animal level, that they were watching something, and he took both her hands in both of his the exact same way she'd once taken his at his mother's funeral. "It's me. It's Miss Des. It's really you. Look at you." Her eyes were bright, wet at the corners, and she blinked hard, once, twice, refusing to let it spill over in front of a room full of people, though her voice wobbled just slightly on the words. "Look at you, Deputy Secretary. I read that. I read that in the paper and I thought, that can't be my Marcus. And then I thought, well, it could be, because I always told you. You told me I argued like I already knew I was right." He was smiling now, and it was the kind of smile that made him look, for just a moment, exactly like the 14-year-old boy who used to eat peanut butter crackers out of her desk drawer. "I kept the note, Miss Des. It's in a frame on my desk. Every morning." "Oh, hush." But she was smiling too now, unable to help it, one hand coming up to press against her own sternum like she was holding something in. Then Marcus turned, slow, deliberate, the warmth draining out of his face, and something considerably colder moving in behind it, and looked at Harold Voss, still standing there with a stranger's badge dangling from his fist, in front of a room that had just watched the Deputy Secretary of State for Elections Administration greet a poll worker like family. "You're the judge here?" Marcus's voice had changed entirely. Gone was the warmth. What replaced it was flat, precise, the voice of a man who'd spent a decade in courtrooms, learning exactly how much authority a calm, quiet question could carry. Harold Voss. Voss's hand had gone slack around the lanyard, like he'd only just remembered he was still holding it. Sir, I'm the presiding judge for this precinct, and I was in the process of verifying. You were in the process of removing a certified poll manager's credentials in front of voters without producing a single document that says you had cause to." Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was so quiet you could hear the coffee urn again. "I've read every complaint filed against this precinct in the last 5 election cycles, Judge Voss. There isn't one with her name on it. Not one." He held out his hand, palm up, unhurried. "The badge. Voss looked down at it in his own fist, as if he'd forgotten what it was. Slowly, he set it in Marcus's open hand. Marcus turned and, with the same unhurried care, clipped it back onto Odetta's collar himself, refastening the little metal clasp that had popped loose 40 minutes earlier, the sound of it clicking shut audible in that dead silent room. "Now," Marcus said, turning back to Voss, and something in the set of his jaw told everyone present that whatever came next was not going to be quick, and it was not going to be quiet. "I'd like to see your provisional ballot log for this precinct. Today's, and this cycle's rejection rate compared to the last three." Voss opened his mouth, closed it. Somewhere behind his eyes, the math of exactly how much trouble he was in started, visibly, to arrive. "Judge Voss," Marcus said again, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I asked you a question." Publicly, accountability scene. It took 11 minutes for Harold Voss's morning to come apart completely, and every one of those minutes happened in front of the same 40 voters who'd watched him take Odetta's badge in the first place. Because Marcus Aldridge, deliberately, did not ask anyone to step outside, did not lower his voice, did not offer Voss the mercy of privacy. Some reckonings, he'd learned a long time ago from the woman standing beside him, needed to happen in the same daylight as the harm. "Provisional log," Marcus said again, and this time Voss, hands not quite steady, pulled the folder from his laptop bag and set it on the check-in table. Marcus scanned it fast, the trained, practiced fast of a man who'd read 10,000 pages of election paperwork in his career, and his eyebrows came up before he'd even finished the first page. 41 flagged for rejection. 3rd Ward, Elm Hollow, Birchfield Terrace. He looked up. "What was your rejection rate in these same 3 precincts last cycle?" Silence. "I don't have that pulled," Voss said. "I do." This came from Odetta, who had quietly opened her own laptop, the one she brought to every election, the one with 3 years of precinct data, organized in a spreadsheet she updated herself. Because she'd learned a long time ago that nobody else was going to do it with the care it deserved. 14. Last cycle, all 3 precincts combined, 14 provisional rejections. This year you've got 41 before 10 o'clock, and doors have been open less than an hour. "That's not," Voss started. "That's a 290% increase, concentrated in exactly the 3 precincts with the highest minority voter registration in this county," Marcus said, quiet, even, and somehow, that quiet was worse than shouting would have been. "I'd like an explanation for that, Judge Voss, and I'd like it to be a good one. Because right now what I'm looking at reads like a pattern, and patterns like this one have a name in federal court." "Excuse me." A voice from the doorway, a young woman, maybe 30, dark hair in a low bun, laminated badge of her own, clipped to a bright red blazer. She'd come in behind Marcus, without anyone noticing, drawn by the commotion visible through the front windows from the precinct 2 blocks, over where she managed the polls. "I'm sorry to interrupt. Rosa Delgado. I run Elm Hollow." She looked directly at Marcus, then at Voss, and something in her expression had the flat, tired certainty of a person who has been waiting a long time for someone with actual authority to finally ask the right question. "I filed a complaint with the county 3 weeks ago about Judge Voss's precinct visits. Nobody got back to me." "What kind of complaint?" Marcus asked. "He came by my precinct twice last week, supposedly for a routine judge's walkthrough, but both times he specifically asked to review my provisional ballot procedures, and both times he told me, and I quote, that I was being too generous with signature cure opportunities for voters with address discrepancies." Rosa's voice was steady, professional, the voice of someone who'd rehearsed saying this calmly because she'd known, somewhere, that someday somebody would actually need to hear it. "I told him I followed the state cure statute to the letter, same as I always have. He told me to use better judgment going forward. I wrote it down. I've got it dated. I can corroborate a version of that," said an older man near the front of the line. Stepping forward now, cane tapping the linoleum. The same veteran with the purple heart pin. who'd spoken up for Odetta 20 minutes before. Eugene Poe. Voted at Birchfield Terrace Thursday during early voting. My provisional got rejected over a signature match. My hands shake. Have for 6 years now, ever since the stroke, and when I asked the poll worker there why nobody offered me a cure affidavit, which I know for a fact is my right under state law, because Miss Dess herself taught a class on it at the VFW hall 2 years back. That poll worker told me the judge had instructed them that cure affidavits were being limited to clear cases only this cycle. He looked at Voss now, dead on, unblinking. That sound like something you'd say, son? Voss said nothing. His jaw worked. A muscle jumped in his cheek. I have it on video, Priya said quietly from near the door, and every head in the room turned toward her. She held her phone up, a little self-conscious now that the moment had actually arrived. 24 minutes of footage sitting in her camera roll that she hadn't fully processed yet herself. From this morning. Him taking the badge. All of it. I wasn't trying to. I didn't know what else to do. You did exactly the right thing, Marcus said, and meant it. He turned back to the provisional folder, flipping through pages now with a different kind of attention, not scanning anymore, reading, and stopped on a page near the back. A single sheet printed 3 precinct names, circled in blue ink that didn't match the black ink of anything else in the folder. What's this? He held it up. Voss's face had gone the color of old paper. That's a reference sheet. Precinct assignments. Whose handwriting is this? Marcus turned the page, studying the circles, the particular slant of them. This isn't yours. I've been reading your signature on official documents for the last 5 minutes. He looked up. Who gave you this list, Judge Voss? The silence stretched. Somewhere in the line, a baby fussed and was hushed. The coffee urn ticked. Boyd Tillman, Voss said finally. So quiet it barely carried, and then louder, almost desperate, like a man who'd been holding a weight over his head for days and had just discovered his arms didn't work anymore. He's a consultant for the Halloran campaign. He told me. He said it was diligence. He said enforcing the rules strictly wasn't corruption. It was just being the adult in the room, he said. And his voice cracked entirely. I wanted to matter. That's the truth of it. I've been an alternate judge for 6 years and nobody's ever once looked at me like I was worth anything, and he made it sound like I finally could be. By throwing out legal ballots from Black and Latino neighborhoods, Odetta's voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut clean through the room like something sharpened for exactly this moment. By taking my badge off my collar in front of 40 people who've known me longer than you've been alive, because you needed somebody smaller to make yourself feel bigger. Voss flinched like she'd struck him. In a way, she had. I have his texts, he said, pulling his phone out with hands that shook now unmistakably. No performance left in them at all. On here. It's all on here. Marcus took the phone. Read. His face, reading it, went very still and very cold. Priscilla. He didn't look up. Get the county elections director on the phone. And get me a call with the AG's election integrity unit before noon. There's one more thing. A young woman near the back of the line stepped forward now, hesitant, twisting a voter registration card between 2 fingers. She looked barely 20, a Birchfield Terrace address on her ID, and her voice shook slightly with the particular nervousness of someone unused to being listened to by anyone with authority. I voted early last week at Birchfield. First time voting, ever. My ballot came back provisional. Because my registration still had my old address on it. I moved in with my aunt in March, hadn't updated it yet. My fault, I know that part's on me. But when I asked what I needed to do to fix it, the poll worker told me. The judge had said address change provisionals from that precinct were low priority for cure processing this cycle, and that I should try again next election. She looked at Voss now, and her voice steadied, hardening into something closer to anger than nerves. I'm 19. That was supposed to be my first vote. I went home and cried about it, and I almost didn't come back today to try again, because I figured, what's the point if it didn't count the first time? What's your name? Marcus asked, gently. Camila Reyes, Camila, I promise you, your vote today is going to count, and so is the one you tried to cast last week. We're going to make sure of that personally, starting this afternoon. He turned back to Voss, and whatever patience had been left in his voice a moment ago had thinned considerably. Low priority for cure processing. That's your language, or somebody else's. Voss didn't answer, which was answer enough. Priscilla had her phone to her ear now, pacing a small, tight circle near the door, speaking low and fast. County Elections Director. Then, within minutes, someone from the Attorney General's office. The words pattern of disparate rejection rates, an outside campaign coordination, an immediate independent audit, drifting across the room in fragments that voters strained, not too subtly, to catch. Rosa Delgado had pulled out her own phone as well, forwarding her 3-week-old unanswered complaint directly to Marcus's office email with a timestamp that would matter a great deal in the weeks ahead. Priya, still recording, had started narrating quietly under her breath for her own footage. Okay, so this is Camila. She's the 4th person, I think, who said basically the same thing. The unconscious instincts of a whole generation, raised to document first and process later. Eugene Poe, watching all of it from his spot near the front of the line, leaned toward Reggie and said, not quite quiet enough for it to be entirely private. You know, in 60-some years of voting in this county, I have never once seen a morning like this. Me neither, Reggie admitted. Good, Eugene said. Some mornings deserve to be the only one of their kind. Around them, the room had gone from silent to something else entirely, a low, rolling murmur of 40 voters who had come in that morning to cast a single ordinary ballot and instead had watched, in real time, the entire architecture of what could have been a quietly stolen runoff come apart in front of them, piece by piece, on the strength of one poll worker's spreadsheet, one bystander's video, 2 witnesses who'd been waiting weeks for somebody to ask, and a badge that had never, in 22 years, needed defending until this morning when it turned out to be the thing that saved an election.
Harold Voss sat down, not dramatically, just sank slowly into the folding chair. Odetta had occupied 22 years' worth of election mornings, the same chair, and put his face in his hands, and for a moment the sharp-blazered man, who'd swept in at 7:52 that morning, looking for someone to matter, to disappeared entirely, replaced by something smaller and sadder, and considerably more honest. I'm going to lose everything, he said, muffled into his palms. My position. Probably probably criminal charges, I don't even. He looked up, and his eyes were wet, red-rimmed, the performance gone out of them completely. I don't even know how to say I'm sorry for something this big. There isn't a way to say it that fixes it. No, Odetta agreed, and her voice, though not unkind, did not rush to comfort him either. There isn't. I keep thinking about that man, Mr. Poe. His hands shake, and I let somebody tell me that was a reason to throw his vote out instead of help him. Voss's voice broke fully now. No dignity left in it to protect. Just a man confronting, in real time, the actual shape of what he'd done rather than the flattering story Tillman had spent 6 weeks telling him about himself. I told myself I was being diligent. I told myself I was the adult in the room. I wasn't. I was just scared and vain, and somebody figured out exactly which buttons to push, and I let him, because it felt good to matter for 5 minutes. That's the truest thing you've said all morning. Odetta pulled a chair around, not to sit close, not yet, but to be at his eye level instead of standing over him. A small physical choice, deliberate. The same choice she'd have made for a struggling 11-year-old in the back row of a classroom. I'm not going to tell you it's all right, Judge Voss, because it isn't, and pretending otherwise wouldn't do either one of us a bit of good. Real people's votes were nearly thrown out this morning because of decisions you made. Mr. Poe's vote, 40 other people's votes. That's not a small thing, and I won't shrink it down to make you feel better faster. I know, barely a whisper. But I'll tell you something else, too, because it's also true. She folded her hands, the same steady, in his hands, folded stillness from that morning, though something in her face had softened now. Not with forgiveness exactly, but with something adjacent to it, the particular patience of a woman who had spent a career believing, stubbornly, that people were capable of becoming better than the worst 5 minutes of their lives, provided somebody was willing to hold them to it rather than just hold it against them. You're going to have consequences, legal ones, professional ones, and they should be real, and I'm not standing in the way of a single one of them. But if you actually mean that apology, if it's not just fear talking, if there's an ounce of the man underneath all this who wants to be somebody worth being, there's a harder road available to you than just disappearing in disgrace. It's called making it right. Slow. Public. No shortcuts. What does that look like? Voss's voice was raw. It looks like you, sitting through my poll worker certification course, front row, same as any first-year volunteer, and passing it on the merits, not because of who you used to be. Odetta's voice had firmed back up now, precise, unmistakably in charge of the room again. It looks like you personally, publicly, helping process cure affidavits for every single one of those 41 voters. Starting today, starting with Mr. Poe. It looks like you testifying, fully and honestly, in whatever proceeding comes out of this, about Boyd Tillman and the Halloran campaign, instead of protecting people who never once protected you. And it looks like a long, long time before anybody in this county trusts you again, and you earning every single day of that trust back instead of expecting it handed to you, which is the exact mistake that got you into that chair in the first place. Voss nodded, slow, and something in his shoulders, the practiced squareness, the performance of a man auditioning for authority he hadn't earned, finally completely let go. "Okay," he said. "Okay, I'll do that. Good." Odetta stood, straightened her cardigan, looked for one moment toward the line of voters still waiting, patient now, quiet, having just watched something they'd be telling their grandchildren about for years. "Now, if it's all the same to everybody, we've got an election to run, and I believe I've got a badge back on my collar and a job to do." A few people in line actually applauded. Reggie wiped his eyes with the back of his vest sleeve, unashamed, and leaned toward Odetta as the line finally, mercifully, started moving again. "Miss Dess, how'd you do that? Stay that steady. So I was ready to come across that table at him myself." "Wasn't steady, baby." She said it low, just for him, checking the next voter's ID as she spoke, the practiced motion never once interrupting the conversation. "My hands were shaking under this table the whole time. Still are, a little." She held one up, briefly, just enough for him to see it. "Steady's not about not being scared or not being angry. It's about not letting scared and angry make your decisions for you. You'll learn that. Takes practice, same as counting a ballot box." Reggie nodded slowly, filing it away the way you file away. "The things people say to you, right before you understand, for the first time, that you've just watched. Somebody teach you something important without ever once calling it a lesson." Marcus, standing a few feet away with Priscilla, already deep in a phone call to the elections director, watched Odetta Marchand pick her pen back up off the check-in table and resume without another word, checking in voters exactly as she had for 22 years, and thought, not for the first time in his life, that he put his faith in his hands, that he had never met another human being who made grace look quite so much like discipline. What happened over the following 6 weeks moved faster than anyone in Pruitt County had ever seen local government move, which Marcus Aldrich would later say, with a dry half smile, was what tended to happen when the state of Georgia's Elections Administration Office and 40 eyewitnesses were all looking at the same set of facts at the same time. Boyd Tillman was gone from the county within 48 hours. Chalkline Consulting's single listed phone number disconnected, its registered address turning out to belong to a UPS store mailbox 2 states away. Vattel put his face in his hands. But not before the Attorney General's Election Integrity Unit had subpoenaed enough of his texts, emails, and expense reports to build a case that would eventually name him, and 2 campaign officials who'd hired him in a formal referral for prosecution. The Halloran campaigns suspended its field operations in Pruitt County within the week, and, not long after, suspended Boyd Tillman's contract entirely, releasing a statement that used the word regret 4 times and the word sorry not once. Harold Voss did not disappear and did not run. He sat through Odetta's poll worker certification course that very next cycle, front row, exactly as promised, and to the visible surprise of several people who'd expected him to quietly slink out of the county rather than face a classroom of volunteers who'd all heard, by then, exactly what he'd done. He came back every single session, took notes, asked questions, and passed the exam on the merits with a score of 91, 4 points higher than the county average. Peace. He spent the better part of that spring helping process cure affidavits for all 41 of the voters whose provisional ballots he'd wrongly flagged, driving out personally, the way Odetta once had for a shaking-handed veteran on a Sunday afternoon, to sit with Eugene Poe at his own kitchen table and walk the paperwork through with him, word by word, until it was right. He testified fully before a state legislative committee investigating outside interference in county election administration, naming names, including his own, without flinching. First, though, came the 41. Every one of the wrongly flagged provisional ballots got cured, verified, and counted within the 10-day window state law allowed. Camila Reyes is among them, her address updated, her first vote as an adult finally logged where it belonged. When the final tally came in on the runoff itself, it turned out those 3 precincts had mattered every bit as much as Boyd Tillman had promised Harold Voss they would, though not in the direction Tillman had been paid to engineer. The race that had been projected to come down to 1,100 votes county-wide ended up decided by 462, a margin the local paper noted, with a kind of understated precision Odetta appreciated, was smaller than the number of provisional ballots initially flagged for rejection in 3 precincts under scrutiny this cycle. At the county commission meeting in late spring, packed tighter than any meeting in Pruitt County's recent memory, folding chairs set up in the hallway. For the overflow, Rosa Delgado stood at the podium first, in the same red blazer she'd worn the morning it all came apart, and read her 3-week-old ignored complaint into the public record word for word, letting the room sit with exactly how long the county had known something was wrong before anyone with authority had bothered to look. Camila Reyes spoke after her, hands shaking on the podium, and said simply, "I almost didn't come back. I want the record to show that somebody almost lost their very first vote because nobody thought a 19-year-old's provisional ballot was worth the extra 5 minutes it would have taken to fix it right the first time." Eugene Poe didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply stood, slow, leaning on his cane, when the commission chair asked if anyone else wished to be heard, and the entire room stood with him, a silent, unplanned ovation that took even Odetta by surprise. Then the Commission voted, 7-0, to establish what it formally called the Steady Hands Poll Worker Training Initiative, funded through a modest annual county appropriation and named, over Odetta's own mild protest that she didn't need a program named after a phrase her grandmother used to say over the ironing board, precisely because of that phrase, at Marcus Aldrich's insistence, delivered in testimony before the commission that left more than one commissioner reaching for a tissue. "I am who I am today," he told the room, voice steady but eyes bright, "because one woman in this county decided a struggling 14-year-old was worth showing up for twice a week, with no pay and no recognition, for an entire school year. This county has an opportunity right now to make sure that kind of showing up isn't just one woman's quiet sacrifice anymore. It should be something we build on purpose and fund on purpose, so it outlives any one of us." The initiative would standardize provisional ballot cure training across every precinct in the county, mandate independent audits of any precinct's rejection rate variance above a set statistical threshold, and fund a permanent small stipend for veteran poll managers willing to mentor first-year workers, the exact unpaid work Odetta Marchand had been doing out of her own pocket and her own patience for over 2 decades. And in the same meeting, on a motion introduced by the county's outgoing registrar, who was retiring at the end of the summer after 19 years in the post, the commission voted to appoint Odetta Marchand as Pruitt County's next registrar of elections, not a caretaker appointment, not an interim placeholder, but the full permanent post. The woman who'd spent 22 years assured this county's elections ran clean. Now, formally, finally, in charge of making sure they always would. A small brass plaque went up beside the front door of the Third Ward firehouse that summer, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, mounted exactly the height where a person waiting in line might read it while they had nothing else to do with their eyes. It read, "Steady hands count votes, and steady hands count for something." In honor of Odetta Marchand, whose integrity, on one Tuesday morning, protected every ballot in this county, she cried, the first time she saw it up on the wall, alone, before the dedication ceremony, when nobody else was there to watch her do it. 1 year later, the Third Ward firehouse smelled the same way it always did on election mornings: coffee, wet umbrellas, the faint diesel ghost under everything else. But this time the rain had held off, and thin gold light came slanting low through the front windows, catching dust in the air the way it does in the kind of photograph somebody keeps for a long time afterward. The line curled out the door again. Same as always. A retired mill worker. A young mother, a different one this year, with a baby small enough to still be in a wrap against her chest, to put his face in his hands. Teenagers who just turned 18, visibly nervous about voting for the first time, checking and rechecking a sample ballot folded soft at the creases, behind the check-in table, 3 folding chairs, 3 laptops. In the middle chair, no longer the middle chair, actually, but a proper desk now, moved in special for the occasion, with a small brass nameplate that read Odetta Marchand, Registrar of Elections, sat Odetta, reading glasses pushed up in hands, reading glasses pushed up into curls gone a little grayer over the year, cardigan a shade of soft green this time instead of lavender, badge clipped to her collar, and this year, for the first time in 23 years, framed by a lanyard the county had specially ordered in gold instead of blue, because somebody on the commission had decided the county's registrar deserved to look the part. To her left, going over a precinct log with the careful, humbled attentiveness of a man determined never again to be the reason somebody's vote didn't count, sat Harold Voss. Not a judge any more, not this cycle or the one before it, but an assistant registrar now, promoted slowly, deliberately, on the strength of a year's worth of unglamorous, correct, well documented work that had never once, in 12 months, given anyone cause to question it. And at the end of the table, in a county issued vest sizes too big, folding sample ballots with the exact same careful concentration his grandmother had brought to every task she'd ever set her hand to, sat 12-year-old Milo Marchand, old enough, this year, for his first official shift as a junior poll clerk, a program the Steady Hands Initiative had launched. That spring specifically, so kids could grow up around the process, instead of just hearing about it second-hand. Grandma Des. Milo leaned over between voters, low enough that only she could hear. "You nervous? Baby, I have never once in my life been nervous behind this table." She didn't look up from the poll book, but there was a smile tucked into the corner of her mouth. "Why are you?" "A little." He admitted it easily, the way kids do when they trust the person they're admitting it to. "What if I mess up the count? Then you count it again." She finally looked at him, steady, the exact look she'd been giving frightened new poll workers for 23 years. "Once because you're supposed to, once because you're nervous, and a third time because I'm sitting right here, and you don't want to have to explain to me why your numbers don't match." Milo laughed, the same laugh he'd had at 6, at 8, at 11, unchanged by grief or growing, or any of the hard years in between, and went back to folding ballots, with the particular seriousness only a 12-year-old given real responsibility for the first time can manage. Near the middle of the line, a familiar face waited her turn, patient, a little more sure of herself than she'd been a year before. Camila Reyes had her registration card out already, address updated, checked twice at home before she'd even left the apartment. When she reached the table, it was Harold Voss who checked her in. And something passed between them, not quite an apology, that had already been said and accepted months before, but something steadier, a kind of mutual acknowledgment of distance traveled. "Mrs. Reyes." He found her name in the poll book without needing to be told how to spell it, which was its own small, deliberate act of care. "Good to see you back. Good to be back." She held his eyes a beat longer than strictly necessary, not unkindly, just making sure he knew she remembered exactly why that mattered. "You still doing the cure affidavit training?" "Every session. Front row's usually mine." A faint, rueful smile. "Some habits I don't plan on breaking." She smiled back, small but genuine, and moved on to Milo's end of the table to collect her ballot, and something in the exchange, brief, unremarkable to anyone, unremarkable, who hadn't been standing in that same room a year earlier, settled a little further into place the quiet, unglamorous work of a wrong being made right, one ordinary interaction at a time. Eugene Poe came through not long after, cane tapping its familiar rhythm on the linoleum, and stopped at the table longer than voting strictly required, the way he'd taken to doing all year at every county meeting Voss also happened to attend. Judge. He still called him that sometimes, though the title didn't apply any more, and Voss had stopped correcting him months back, understanding it wasn't really about the title at all. "Mr. Poe." Hands still shake. Eugene held one up, deliberately, matter of fact rather than pointed. "But nobody's told me this year. That's a reason to throw my vote out. Nobody ever will again, not on my watch." Voss said it plainly, without performance, the particular quiet certainty of a man who'd spent a year proving a sentence like that could actually mean something instead of just sounding good. Eugene studied him a moment, the way you study a piece of work to see if it's a piece it's actually finished, or just looks that way from a distance, and seemed finally satisfied enough to nod once, and moves on toward Odetta's desk to say his good mornings properly. Near the door, unnoticed at first, a black Ford Explorer pulled into the lot, parked a little more carefully this time than it had a year before, and Marcus Calais came in a few minutes later. No clipboard this time, no unannounced sweep, just a man who'd asked to be here today, on this particular anniversary, because some mornings deserve to be witnessed on purpose rather than stumbled into. He caught Odetta's eye across the room. She smiled at him the way she'd smiled at Milo, steady, warm, entirely unsurprised, as if some part of her had simply expected, the way she expected most good things eventually, if you were patient and did right by people, that he'd come back. "Miss Des," he said, crossing to the table. "Marcus." She reached up and touched the gold lanyard at her collar, briefly, the way a person touches something they still can't quite believe belongs to them. "Look at us." "Steady hands," he said. "Steady hands," she agreed, and picked her pen back up and got back to work. "Here's what I keep coming back to, thinking about that Tuesday morning in Pruitt County. Fit put his face in his gauze. Dignity was Harold Voss's to give or take away in the first place. He could snatch a badge off a woman's collar in front of 40 strangers, and for about 90 seconds it must have felt to him like power, but real standing, the kind that survives a bad morning, the kind that outlasts somebody else's insecurity dressed up as authority, that isn't handed out by the person doing the disrespecting. It was already there in Odetta Marchand, built over 22 years of showing up, one steady hand at a time, and no clipboard, no blazer, no borrowed importance was ever going to be enough to take that away from her. It just took one honest morning for everybody else in that room to finally see what had been true the whole time. So here's what I want to ask you, and I mean it sincerely. Has there ever been a moment in your own life where somebody tried to make you smaller in front of a crowd, and you found out later that your quiet, steady record spoke louder than their loudest accusation ever could? I'd love to hear that story. Drop a comment below and tell me, in just a few words, what you held on to in that moment. I read every single one, and I promise you, stories like that are exactly why this channel exists. If this one moved you, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we've got another story coming next week that I think is going to hit just as hard, about a hospital janitor nobody thought twice about, and the night one decision he made quietly saved somebody nobody expected him to know at all. Thank you for watching, and thank you always for believing that dignity, real dignity, doesn't need anybody's permission to be true.